Today, I wanted to talk about an issue that's affecting the city of Jacksonville that I think really illuminates some of the problems that we see all over the country as well as abroad. The U.S. has been struggling with how it should deal with the Confederacy in the South, its history, its legacy. And for years, this debate was framed as remembering history and or Southern culture or propagating hate. Right now, there's plenty of people that believe that any attempt to hide the Confederate monuments in Jacksonville would amount to a type of whitewashing. But is that true? Beyond the obvious question of whether these monuments would be better preserved as historical symbols in a museum with context, is it even true that they reflect the history of the city? And for this, I feel it's necessary to step back and actually have a history lesson about the city of Jacksonville and why you don't know what you think you knew about the bold city of the South. Jacksonville dates back to the earliest era of European colonization, founded as Fort Caroline by the French. However, the entire area near the mouth of the St. Johns was also already inhabited by various tribes in the Timucua culture group. When the Spanish then settled St. Augustine just south of the French Huguenot fort, they raided the fort and slaughtered all of its inhabitants, throwing their bodies into the Matanzas Bay, which they named after the massacre. Jacksonville then eventually gets founded during English occupation of Florida and is originally called Cowford. While the Spanish had ruled the territory, they had outlawed slavery, so there were already several free black communities, such as what would later become Lavilla. With the English, the town became a central spot for cattle farmers in Florida to bring their herds north across the river. Several plantations spring up around the town, including Kingsley Plantation, which is briefly owned by a West Indian black woman. Soon, though, the state is taken by the new USA in the 1820s, after a brief return to Spanish hands and the arrival of the Seminole tribes from Georgia and the Carolinas that were fleeing persecution from Andrew Jackson's army. This led to the Seminole Wars, the annexation of Florida, and Jackson becoming military governor of the state. Jacksonville renames itself in his honor, but he never visits the city and he despises Florida. Meanwhile, Jacksonville continues to develop. As it is now one of the primary ports, if not the primary port in Florida at the time, all sorts of people begin to appear in the city. By the time that the Civil War breaks out, Jacksonville is actually one of the only Florida cities with a sizable pro-Union population. The Union Army actually operated a fort just north of the city, Fort Clinch, which would be traded without fighting several times in the war. The city itself, however, was not lucky enough to be spared military hardship. When Confederate soldiers were fleeing the town they had only briefly controlled, they set the town ablaze in order to stop the Union's advance. After the Battle of Olustee, which halted Union advances into Florida, the Union regrouped in Jacksonville and dug in, constructing earthen fortifications in the outlying suburb of Lavilla and in the future neighborhood of Brooklyn. These Union forces were, by the way, actually black soldiers. When the war ended, the town began to rebuild, and many of the black soldiers decided to take up residence in the town. They largely populated Lavilla and Brooklyn, and they helped the city grow as the pine and turpentine industries expanded the city and grew its shipping. And they worked on the rail lines as the Plant Railroad made Jacksonville the true heart of Florida and the largest railroad hub in the South. At this point, the city was about two-thirds black, and Lavilla and Brooklyn were both incorporated into the city proper. Lavilla and its combination of rail yards and wharfs became a flourishing point of international cultural melding. Greek immigrants and Chinese, black and white rail yard workers, and longshoremen lived and drank next to the red light district. Stephen Foster met his wife while she actually ran a brothel there. All of this would grow the city exponentially until the Great Fire. 90% of the city burnt down. A blaze that began in one of the bedding factories in Lavilla eventually raged until it became the third largest fire in the U.S., behind only the Chicago fire and the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. A lot of people think that that's where the story ends. The city simply limped along after this. But that's where you're wrong, kiddo. In fact, the year after the fire, the city had already built past its previous peak. Spurred on by the streetcar lines that used to epitomize the city, Jacksonville reached out into all directions to build streetcar suburbs in some of the most popular neighborhoods to this day: Ortega, Avondale, Murray Hill, Riverside, Newtown, Durkeeville, Springfield, and many more. Among them, it was the historic black neighborhoods such as Lavilla, Sugar Hill, Durkeeville, and Brooklyn that grew to be the most thriving and culturally relevant. During the 1920s, Lavilla became known as the Harlem of the South, and many artists, thinkers, and activists lived, worked, or performed there. It is where the term the blues was first recorded in usage, where Ray Charles started performing, where Zora Neale Hurston did much of her writing and became familiar with the Gullah Geechee culture. It's where James Weldon Johnson, one of the founding members of the NAACP and an acclaimed writer, was born and raised. Jacksonville, during this era, was the central hub for the South, and our rail station was the largest in the South. Our population was growing in leaps and bounds, and in Sugar Hill, many of the first black millionaires built their mansions and a black medical university. But while our city leaders had other plans. Next to these mansions, they built a trash incinerator. While white inhabitants fled in droves to the new streetcar suburbs in Avondale and Riverside, the city refused to even connect the sewer lines to many of the historic black neighborhoods, including to Brooklyn, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. And things only got worse from the 1930s on. The city worked with National City Lines, and within a few years, they had dismantled almost every inch of streetcar rail in the city. When urban renewal projects began gaining traction nationally, Jacksonville named most of the historic black neighborhoods slums, even Sugar Hill and its mansions, and set to work on a multi-decade project to tear them down. Lavilla saw itself split in half and was largely devastated by the construction through the heart of the neighborhood of I-95. The road also cut through and into Durkeeville, Newtown, and many other historic black neighborhoods. To this day, there is no access to these neighborhoods from I-95, and the conspicuous lack of exits from the southbound ramps and the lack of roads to continue under the support beams is a constant reminder of how intentional urban renewal's goals were. The rail yards and ports were also reorganized out of the black neighborhoods and into whiter parts, like Mayport and the North Side. The resulting lack of jobs drained the neighborhoods, and in 1960, a race riot began known as Axe Handle Saturday after a group of student protesters sat at a whites-only lunch counter. By the end of the decade, the city had consolidated with the county, and resources were pulled from the largely black urban core to pay for road construction and services far out in the new white suburbs in Arlington, Glenlea, Mandarin, Orange Park, and others. This land was previously just cheap farmland purchased for next to nothing, but after consolidation, it became prime real estate for massive urban sprawl developments and white flight. This stretched the urban neighborhood's resources, and when legal housing segregation ended, any black family with the means to do so attempted to flee the now doomed neighborhoods. Segregation had only ended for blacks rich enough to escape it. Now the neighborhoods were left with constant urban renewal strategies meant to destroy them, drastically falling housing values leading to drastically low property taxes, leading to almost no resources for education, a terrible and worsening public transportation system that was neglected by the largely car-owning white city leadership, and hostility from the local police, which, by the 1980s, was really focused on helping urban renewal projects by heavily patrolling and harassing people within the neighborhoods and bringing property values down even lower. Finally, in the 1980s, Mayor Ed Austin, who may or may not have participated in Axe Handle Saturday, was elected under the banner of his River City Renaissance Plan. The plan called for massive amounts of city funds to go to tearing down blight neighborhoods, especially Lavilla, and the rest of the chunk of the money was spent to construct the Jacksonville Landing. Soon, the remaining residents of Jacksonville's oldest suburb and urban neighborhood were evicted, and almost every surviving building was condemned, and the residents were moved into the Ambassador Hotel for the last few years of its own operation. The wrecking balls commenced, and only a small handful of buildings from this once thriving community still stand. The city was legally obligated not to tear most of those down, but has never made an effort to maintain them. Often, people have tried to purchase the buildings, and several times in the past 25 years, they have done so for far beyond the values of these properties. But each time, the city has refused, claiming that they could get a better offer. Meanwhile, they let the buildings burn down and collapse. One of the only buildings that the city does not own is the Whetstonian. The building was once a grocery store, and it was purchased by a Mr. Whetstone during the Renaissance plan, and he decided to use it as a personal museum of the neighborhood that he once loved, where he and his father had grown up. He took artifacts and building features, mannequins and elaborate mirrors, art and sculptures, and anything he could find from the wreckage of the buildings that he used to go to and live in and eat and have dates in. He decorated the Whetstonian with all of that, and then had to plead for the city to reconnect the water lines again. The city tried to remove him from the property several times, and to this day, the city seems set on dismantling the house and turning it into yet another grass lot. One more achievement for Lenny Curry and a series of mayors who have run a majority Democratic city as a guinea pig for the state Republican policies and rising stars. Mr. Whetstone recently died, and while there's no chance of raising enough money to save his accomplishment, there is a GoFundMe page for his family. This is the fate of the black neighborhoods of Jacksonville, built by retired black Union soldiers who fought for freedom despite facing being tortured to death if they were captured by Confederate soldiers. Meanwhile, Confederates, whose only contribution was to burn the original city to the ground, have monuments across the city, including in front of City Hall. And it was only a few years ago that the city decided to change the name of the high school, named after the founder of the KKK. That is the legacy of Jacksonville city leadership, and that is the situation of Jacksonville's Confederate monuments. And so I think it's safe to say that more than anything, I want this city to finally own up. I want the city to finally abide by the idea of heritage and not hate, and accept what its heritage was and what it will be.